and welcome to everybody on Cloud Fitness. So in today's video, we are going to see what is a Databricks cluster, how do we create a Databricks cluster, what are the different configurations associated to the Databricks cluster. So let's move ahead and let's go with the basics again. So already I have explained to all of you in my previous videos that when we talk about clusters, right? Clusters are nothing but a set of virtual machines that are used to do your work, right? Now in these clusters you have different executors. Now clusters have nodes. Right, clusters have nodes. Now each node might have multiple executors, but in case of Databricks, each node is equal to one executor. One node is equal to one executor in terms of Databricks, right? Now in these executors might have one or more cores. So whatever processing that is done in parallel, that is done with the help of these cores, because each core takes one partition, each core takes one task and run this task at the same time. They do it in parallel. So you have a driver. Whenever you write a code in your driver using cluster manager, what happens is your code, everything gets divided in form of your stages and your tasks. This is done with the help of directed acyclic graph, which divides your whole job in form of stages and in form of tasks. Now each of these tasks executes on the executors, and each executor essentially is made up of codes, right? Codes defines the degree of parallelism that will happen when your job runs. Now this code, each core will take one partition at a time, execute it. When it is done, it will take another partition and execute the work. So this is how your cluster is. Now if I go to the Databricks UI, if you go on the left hand side to the compute option here, you will see this is the place where you create a cluster. This is the whole UI to do that. So you have two types of clusters basically: all-purpose clusters and job clusters, right? All-purpose clusters and job clusters. So these all-purpose clusters are usually used for your development tasks, right? Whenever you have set of developers, you have 10 developers and you are trying to do some work in your development environment, then in that case you go for all-purpose cluster. Otherwise, whenever you create a production ready job, right, in that case you should always go for the job clusters. Now coming on to the all-purpose cluster, let us click on this create a cluster over here. The moment you click on create a cluster, you just provide a cluster name. Let's say YouTube I'm giving as the cluster name. Now there is something called as cluster mode, right? If you hover over this question mark, you will see it says that there are three different kind of cluster mode: high concurrency, standard and single node. Right, so single node clusters are basically first of all, usually we will not use single node clusters, right? Because single node cluster does not have any workers. So when I say it does not have any workers, if you go back to this Excel, it will not have any executor. It will only have driver. So it will not have node 1, it will not have node 2, it will only have driver, right? So that is why usually our workloads are not that less we need single nodes. So usually single nodes are not used much. So, and then the second is the standard one. So standard ones are basically normal clusters which you might create anytime and you might use it. So these are used for single users. So if I am the one who is working, I can create a standard cluster for myself and I can run SQL, Python, R or Scala workloads on it. But when you talk about high concurrency clusters are specifically used when you create a cluster and you have a group of people using that cluster. So that is called a high concurrency cluster because it is optimized to run concurrent workloads. So when I say it is optimized to run concurrent workloads, I essentially mean that if we have a group of people, then high concurrency clusters are actually configured to allow multiple users to work on the same cluster. So multiple team members can use the same cluster at the same time, right? And still they will get optimal performance. So if I am running a command on a high concurrency cluster at my end, and there is another user who is running another command on the high concurrency cluster at his end, right? So the job will not interfere. Both of our jobs will be completely isolated. They will not interfere. That is why high concurrency cluster is used. So based on your use case, you should choose between high concurrency, standard, or single node cluster. Single node are essentially used for like a very small data volumes. Like if I'm doing this YouTube video, I'm essentially not using a high volume of data, so I can go for a single node cluster. Now, so let it be standard for now, and then you have something called as Databricks runtime version. So if you again go to this particular question mark, right? So this is essentially used for your cluster creation. Now this runtime is nothing but it is set of your whole Spark, right? Your whole Spark, all the optimizations that are done on a cluster are within this runtime. So there are multiple types of runtime. If you do open this drop down, right? So you have a standard, ML, genomics, workload. So ML, I think we don't need to use. These are usually for iterative workloads for machine learning programs. Now genomics also, it's not related to your data engineering workloads, so mostly you will go for the standard ones itself. Now here you have different runtimes. So essentially I see that runtimes below 6.4 are not available anymore, but yeah, usually you should always choose the second latest runtime available. That is the one you should always go for. So for example, I have chosen like 10.4 LTS. Now remember that in 10.4 LTS runtime you have Scala 2.12 and the Spark version that is there is 3.2.1, right? But if you choose the older version of runtime, you will see even the Spark version is lower. So you have to carefully choose the version that you want to use. And yes, so pretty much always try to use the latest one, or the second latest one would be the good one. Also, in case you want to use something called as Photon, you can go ahead and use it. So regarding Photon also, I have made a video. I will leave the link in the description box in case you want to check that out. I will leave the link in description. So if you want, if you have if your code is it contains a lot of SQL queries, if in that case and you want to optimize it, then in that case Photon is very helpful, because it is a vectorized engine basically in the Databricks, which is which helps you to give high performance to your SQL workloads. So you can go ahead and choose this Photon option as well. I will leave the link in description for the video which I made earlier on Photon, right? So right now I'm not going to choose Photon because I don't need it. And similarly, there is an option of autopilot options, right? So enable auto scaling. Okay, we'll talk about this later. Then you have something called as terminate after 120 minutes of inactivity. In fact, this also, both these two options we'll talk about later. Now, the main thing here in the cluster is the worker type and the driver type, right? So what is this worker and driver type? If I go back to my Excel sheet, right? This is the driver and this is the worker, right? This executors. What is this? This is the worker, right? So this nodes, these are all worker nodes, right? So driver and executor is this. Now you have an option to choose the worker type and the driver type, right? You also have an option to choose let me just disable this option first for your understanding. So you also have an option to choose the number of workers. So you have an option to choose the number of executors. Basically, if I go back here, you can choose the number of nodes, right? And in Databricks, in one node you will only have one executor. So it is good to say that this does not exist, right? So let me just okay, so let me just delete it in fact. So in terms of Databricks, you will only have one executor for each node, right? So one node equal to one executor, as simple as that in terms of Databricks, right? So you have an option to choose how many workers you want, right? How many nodes you want, one node, two node, three node. So let me in fact let's do one thing. Let's replicate this. So these are two workers here, right? So let me choose two workers. Two nodes means two workers. I'm choosing two here. And then you have something called as worker type. Now what type of worker you want to choose, because there might be different memory associated to it and different number of cores associated to it, right? Now if you see, it is 14 GB memory and 4 cores. Now what is this 14 GB memory, 4 cores? So these are the cores: core 1, core 2, core 3, core 4. So it will have 14 GB memory in total. This worker will have 14 GB memory in total, and it will have 4 cores. So at a time, your one machine will run 4 partitions. So one worker will run 4 partitions at a time, right? Because you are choosing 2 workers here, right? 2 workers, and each worker will have 14 GB memory and 4 cores. So total how many cores will be there? Total 4 into 2, 8 cores will be there, right? So 8 cores means 8 partition will run at a time. Now 8 partitions will run at a time in parallel. So that is how this is how you actually see the configuration, and also the general purpose. So these are the different types of worker types. General purpose is used for your kind of general stuff, like right now I'm using for your normal development stuff. Now for general purpose HDD, never go for this option. Memory optimized remote HDD, don't go for this option. This is also actually hard disk drive, and you don't want to use hard disk drive, right? You should always use you should not use this hard disk drive, because the read and writes are not faster if you go for this. So never use this HDD option, and in fact remote HDD don't use at all. So memory optimized, yes, you can use that. Memory optimized, it is optimized to handle the memory. And then you have delta cache accelerated, storage optimized, memory optimized. So memory optimized is essentially it is used in case you do not have too much shuffle in your data, right? In case you are not using very complex stuff, you are not using complex transformation, go for memory optimized. If you are using complex transformation, go for storage optimized. Now in the storage optimized also, there is something called as delta cache accelerated. So this is by default cache which is available, and it helps us to speed up the query. So even regarding this also, I have made a detailed video. I will leave the link in the description box here, so that you can have a more detailed video on each of these worker types. I will leave it in the description. So one is the Photon one and one is this one. I will leave the link in description. Similarly, you have compute optimized. So in case you have some iterative operations, such as your machine learning workloads, something that you need to do again and again, so you don't need a memory for that much memory for it. So in that case, you go for compute optimized, right? GPU is not for data engineering stuff. Now I will go for this general purpose TS series, 14 GB memory and 4 cores, right? So I have 2 workers over here. So similarly, driver type, you can choose driver type whichever you want based on your workloads. You can keep same as worker as well. So in case little more detail on driver type, I'll tell you like in the later videos. Now this is the basic configuration on how do you create a cluster in the Databricks. Now there's an option of terminate after 120 minutes of inactivity. So right now, if I create this cluster, right, it will start. The moment it starts, it gets the virtual machines for you, right? It starts, right? Now you so this cluster is nothing but a set of virtual machine, right? So you are actually starting the virtual machines. Now if you want to stop the cluster for after certain time period, so let's say you want to stop the cluster after 15 minutes, so you just write 15 minutes of inactivity. It will help you to save the costs basically, right? And then you have an option of enable auto scaling. So if I click on this option is essentially used for minimum and maximum workers. Now what happens is, if your workload increases, then in that case, if you have specified maximum workers over here, it will automatically fetch 8 workers. And in case you do not need that many workers, your workload is less, then in that case it just scales down, it goes down, and let's say it needs only 2 workers, so it will just get you the 2 workers. So it helps in cost optimization. And at the same time, if you disable it, then automatically always it will get you 2 workers, no matter your workload increases or decreases. So this is how you create a cluster. And also You have something called as spot instances here. If you want to decrease the cost even further, you can click on the spot instances. What happens is, if there are any running machines already available, at a lower cost, it will try to fetch you those machines. Similarly, you have some, if you go down in the advanced run options, right? If you go to this advanced run option and just click on tags here first, you will see that there is a cluster name, and the moment you create a cluster ID gets generated here, right? And similarly, if you want to do any kind of logging, right, so there is something called as Databricks file system, which we will talk about. Now this Databricks file system, at any particular place, right, if you want to store the logs of your cluster, you just mention the path over here, it will store the logs of your cluster. Now init scripts, usually I recommend not to use any init scripts, because it might interfere with the cluster creation. So if you want to use any kind of pre-deployment script, so let's say whenever you start a cluster, you want a script to run. Now in that case, just give a path for that particular script, and whenever the cluster will start, initially it will start executing the script. Also, there are multiple extra configurations if you have to add. We will see it in our upcoming videos if we need any kind of extra configurations basically. Now you can add it over here. It will help you, whenever your cluster will be created, automatically these configurations will become active. So that kind of configuration, you can keep it over here. And if I go and click on create clusters, you will see that it starts creating the cluster. So here you go, this cluster is starting, and and similar, once this cluster starts, you have an option of libraries over here. Now there might be some workloads where you want to use your custom coding, or you need to use your open source libraries. In that case, you have to do it over here. If you click on install new, here there are multiple options to upload the library, right? You can upload a jar file. If you have it in your system, you can upload a Python egg, or you can upload a Python wheel file as well from your system. This upload means from your system. DBFS, ADLS. So DBFS is by default a Databricks storage. So if you want to use that path, you can use it. We will talk about this later on, what is DBFS and all. So similarly, if you have any kind of PyPI package, in that case you can go ahead and use this. Similarly, let's say if you have any Maven packages, let's say for example for event hubs, we usually use this package, right? Now if I click on install, it will start installing this library. So again, I'll go click on new. So similarly, if you have any CRAN packages, in that case, you can go ahead and start installing the libraries. So there is also these APIs. Through APIs also you can install the libraries in your cluster basically, right? So similarly, if you want to give permissions to few people, special permissions to few people on this cluster, in that case you can go ahead and you will have groups, or you will have users. You can give permissions to your cluster over here, right? And similarly, these driver logs, event logs, everything I will tell you later in this. And if you want to edit the configurations here, you can edit the configurations. You can click on edit, and then whatever configurations you want to change, you can change it over here. And if you click on the right hand side here, you will see this JSON. So whatever you have configuration which you have provided, that gets deployed in form of this JSON, right? And now basically what happens is, you have this job APIs, or you have these cluster APIs, right? Using those cluster APIs, you can automatically deploy the clusters using these scripts. So for example, this is the cluster, let's say I have created in development environment. If I copy this and I have a script running which takes this particular JSON file, and it can automatically deploy it onto the production environment. So that kind of thing is also available, which most of the companies they do to do it automatically, to automatically deploy clusters in production, because you should not have direct access in production to create clusters, right? So for that we do use PowerShell scripts. You can use different scripts to do that. I might make video on that later on, but that is not very much necessary in this particular a playlist. I will create video on that for sure. Similarly, you have something called as DBU per hour, right? Databricks units per hour. Now, based on the Databricks runtime version that you select, based on the driver and the worker you select, you have to pay charges, right? So that is what is called your DBU per hour. So this is basically charged by Databricks, and your virtual machine charges are taken by Microsoft. So these are the two different charges that occur. And here you can see the configuration. So we have selected one driver which has 14 GB memory and 4 cores, and then you have two workers. So both the two workers together have 28 GB of memory and they have 8 cores, right? Two workers together. So this is how you basically define your cluster. Now in case you want to delete the cluster, just click on this delete option over here and click on delete. So basically you will be able to delete your cluster over here, right? And because I already have a cluster here, so I don't want to create a new one. Similarly, you have something called as job cluster. So job clusters are created when you create a job. I will be explaining this when I create a job, and I explain how to create a job and everything. So that is the time when we will use this job clusters. You have something called as pools as well. I'll talk about these things later, because otherwise this video becomes very long, and I don't want it to be. So thank you so much for being till here, and do remember to like, subscribe and share my channel. Thank you so much.